Behind the flamboyant costumes and stadium performances, Freddie Mercury was fighting a silent battle that nearly destroyed him. What he hid from the world will break your heart, revealing a darkness that even his closest friends struggled to understand. This is the untold story of how rock music's most confident performer battled demons that threatened to silence his voice forever. From the outside, Freddie Mercury appeared to be living the dream. Queen had just delivered the most iconic performance in Live Aid history, cementing their status as one of the greatest rock bands ever. Freddie was wealthy, famous, and adored by millions around the world. But inside Garden Lodge, his London mansion, a very different story was unfolding. Behind the locked doors and drawn curtains, Freddie was drowning in a darkness so profound that even he couldn't understand it. The man who radiated confidence on stage spent his private hours consumed by self-doubt, loneliness, and a depression so severe that it threatened everything he'd built. This is the story of that secret battle, the friends who saved him, and how music became both his prison and his salvation. The perfect facade. Freddie Mercury had spent his entire career perfecting the art of performance, creating a larger-than-life persona that captivated audiences worldwide. But what started as theatrical expression gradually became a mask he couldn't remove, and the distance between Freddie Mercury, the performer, and Farrokh Bulsara, the person, grew wider with each passing year. By the mid-1980s, those closest to Freddie began noticing changes that alarmed them. His legendary parties at Garden Lodge became less frequent, and when he did host gatherings, he seemed distracted, going through the motions of being the gracious host while clearly not present mentally. Mary Austin, his closest confidant, later recalled that Freddie would sometimes disappear during his own parties, retreating to his bedroom for hours while guests continued downstairs. "There were nights when I'd find him sitting alone in the dark," Mary revealed years later. "The house would be full of people, music would be playing, but Freddie would be upstairs by himself, staring at nothing. When I'd ask if he was okay, he'd put on that brilliant smile and say, 'Just catching my breath, darling.' But his eyes told a different story." But what Mary and others didn't fully understand at the time was that Freddie was experiencing something far more serious than simple exhaustion or social fatigue. He was sliding into a depression that would nearly cost him everything, and the warning signs had been building for years. What happened next would reveal just how deep that darkness had become, and you won't believe how close he came to giving up entirely. The spiral begins. The roots of Freddie's depression ran deeper than the pressures of fame or the exhaustion of constant touring. At its core was a profound sense of isolation that came from living a double life in an era when being openly gay could destroy a career. Freddie had built walls around his authentic self, and those walls had become a prison. In public, he was the confident, flamboyant rock god who commanded stages and dominated headlines. In private, he struggled with questions of identity, belonging, and whether anyone truly knew or loved the real person beneath the persona. The disconnect between these two versions of himself created a psychological fracture that grew more painful with each year. Peter Freestone, Freddie's personal assistant, witnessed the beginning of what he later described as Freddie's dark period in early 1984. He stopped eating regularly. His sleep schedule became completely erratic, and he'd spend days in his music room without actually creating anything, Freestone recalled. He'd sit at the piano for hours, but instead of playing, he'd just stare at the keys. The symptoms of clinical depression were unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, but in the mid-1980s, mental health wasn't discussed openly, especially not among rock stars who were supposed to be invincible. Freddie himself didn't understand what was happening to him. He only knew that the joy he once found in music, in performance, in life itself, had somehow evaporated. Friends began receiving late-night phone calls from Freddie that would last for hours. He'd talk in circles, asking existential questions about the meaning of success, whether his music mattered, whether anyone would remember him after he was gone. These weren't the philosophical musings of an artist. They were cries for help that Freddie couldn't articulate directly. The breaking point. The crisis reached its peak in the autumn of 1985, just months after Queen's triumphant Live Aid performance. The cruel irony wasn't lost on those close to Freddie. He had just delivered what many considered the greatest live performance in rock history, yet privately, he was more miserable than he'd ever been. But what happened on a rainy October night would force everyone to confront the severity of Freddie's condition, and it would change everything. Mary Austin received a phone call at 2 a.m. that she would never forget. It was Freddie, but his voice was different, flat, emotionless, frighteningly calm. "I just wanted to say goodbye, darling," he said. "Thank you for everything." Mary's blood ran cold. The finality in his tone was unmistakable. "I'll be right there," she said, already grabbing her coat. "Don't do anything. Promise me you won't do anything. I'm coming." The drive from Mary's flat to Garden Lodge normally took 20 minutes. She made it in 12, running red lights and breaking every speed limit. When she arrived, she found the front door unlocked, a disturbing detail for someone as security conscious as Freddie. The house was dark except for a single light coming from the music room. What Mary found in that room would haunt her for years. Freddie was sitting at his piano, surrounded by empty bottles of vodka and champagne. Scattered around him were dozens of photographs, images of his parents, his sister, his cats, Queen performing at their peak. It looked like someone preparing to say goodbye to their entire life. "He looked at me with these empty eyes," Mary later recalled, her voice breaking even decades later when telling the story. "And he said, 'I don't know how to be Freddie Mercury anymore. I don't know how to be anyone.'" The intervention. Mary immediately called Brian May and Roger Taylor, both of whom dropped everything and rushed to Garden Lodge. What followed was an intervention that saved Freddie's life, though it would take years for him to fully recover from the depths of depression that had nearly consumed him. The three friends stayed with Freddie through the night, taking turns talking to him, listening to him, and simply being present. Freddie spoke with brutal honesty about feelings he'd been suppressing for years, the loneliness that came from never being able to be fully himself, the exhaustion of constantly performing even in his private life, the fear that his music was becoming meaningless repetition. He told us he felt like a fraud, Brian May revealed years later. Here was this man who had written some of the most beloved songs in rock history, who could make 80,000 people sing in unison, and he felt like he had nothing real to offer. The depression had completely distorted his perception of himself and his achievements. Roger Taylor described feeling helpless in the face of Freddie's pain. "We could see he was suffering, but we didn't have the language or the understanding to know how to help him properly." Mental health wasn't something people talked about then, especially not rock musicians who were supposed to be invincible. As dawn broke over London, the group made a pact. Freddie would seek professional help, though he insisted it be done discreetly to protect his privacy. His friends would check on him daily, making sure he wasn't isolating himself. And most importantly, they would create a support system that allowed Freddie to be vulnerable without judgment. But the road to recovery would be long and difficult, and what Freddie discovered during his treatment would fundamentally change how he approached both his music and his life. The journey back from the edge of darkness had only just begun, and nobody could have predicted what it would ultimately teach him. The path to healing. Freddie began seeing a therapist who specialized in treating high-profile clients who needed absolute discretion. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront painful truths about his childhood, his sexuality, his relationship with fame, and the persona he'd created that had become both his greatest asset and his heaviest burden. Through therapy, Freddie began to understand that his depression wasn't a weakness or a character flaw. It was a medical condition exacerbated by years of suppressing his authentic self. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. It meant acknowledging that the Freddie Mercury the world knew was, in many ways, a construct. But it also opened the possibility of finding a healthier balance between performance and authenticity. One of the breakthrough moments in his treatment came when his therapist asked him to identify activities that brought him genuine joy rather than professional satisfaction. Freddie struggled with the question, realizing that he'd spent so long performing that he'd lost touch with what actually made him happy as opposed to what garnered applause. He started small, spending more time with his cats, which brought him simple, uncomplicated joy. Gardening at Garden Lodge, getting his hands dirty and watching things grow. Cooking elaborate meals for small groups of close friends rather than hosting massive parties for acquaintances. These activities might seem trivial, but for someone who had lost touch with authentic pleasure, they were revolutionary. Music, interestingly, became part of both the problem and the solution. Writing and performing had become so associated with pressure and expectation that they'd lost their therapeutic value. But Freddie's therapist encouraged him to reconnect with music as personal expression rather than commercial product. And here's what happened next that would transform Queen's entire creative approach. Music as medicine. During this period of recovery, Freddie began writing music differently. Instead of crafting songs with commercial appeal or audience expectations in mind, he started using composition as a form of therapy, expressing emotions he couldn't articulate in conversation. Many of these songs would never be released, existing only as personal artifacts of his healing journey. However, some of this more emotionally honest songwriting did make it onto Queen's albums. Songs from A Kind of Magic, and especially The Miracle, carry a vulnerability and introspection that wasn't present in earlier Queen work. Tracks like Pain Is So Close to Pleasure and Was It All Worth It contain lyrics that directly reference Freddie's battle with depression, though most listeners never understood their autobiographical nature. Brian May noticed the change in Freddie's creative process immediately. He stopped worrying so much about whether a song would be a hit and started writing about what he actually felt, May observed. Some of the most powerful vocals he ever recorded came during this period because he was singing from a place of genuine emotion rather than technical perfection. The recording studio, which had sometimes been a source of stress and conflict, became a sanctuary where Freddie could express the full range of his emotional experience. His bandmates learned to recognize when he was using a session to work through something personal, and they supported that process by following his lead rather than pushing their own creative agendas. But recovery from depression isn't linear, and Freddie experienced setbacks that tested both his resolve and his support system. There were days when the darkness returned with such intensity that getting out of bed felt impossible. There were recording sessions he couldn't complete because the emotional weight of the material overwhelmed him. There were performances where he had to dig impossibly deep to find the energy to command the stage. The support network. What kept Freddie afloat during the worst periods was the network of support his friends had committed to providing. Mary Austin established a routine of calling him every morning, sometimes just to chat for a few minutes, other times for hours-long conversations when he needed them. These daily check-ins became a lifeline that Freddie could count on even when everything else felt uncertain. Jim Hutton, who became Freddie's partner during this period, provided the kind of stable, judgment-free relationship that Freddie had been missing. Unlike many people in Freddie's orbit who were dazzled by his fame, Jim loved Freddie for who he was, not what he could provide or how he made them look. This unconditional acceptance was profoundly healing for someone who had spent so long feeling that he needed to perform even in his personal relationships. His Queen bandmates also stepped up in ways that deepened their friendship beyond their professional collaboration. They learned to read Freddie's moods, understanding when to give him space and when to insist on his participation. They protected him from excessive pressure while still holding him accountable to commitments, finding the delicate balance between support and enabling. Peter Freestone, living at Garden Lodge and managing Freddie's daily life, became attuned to the signs that Freddie was sliding into a darker place. He'd notice when Freddie stopped caring about his appearance, when he withdrew from social interaction, when his eating and sleeping patterns became erratic. These early warning signs allowed for intervention before crises developed. The transformation. By 1987, Freddie had achieved something remarkable. Not a complete elimination of his depression, which is rarely possible with clinical depression, but a sustainable management strategy that allowed him to function and even thrive despite the condition. He learned to recognize his triggers, to ask for help when he needed it, and to be gentler with himself during difficult periods. Perhaps most importantly, he began dismantling the rigid separation between Freddie Mercury, the performer, and Farrokh Bulsara, the person. He allowed more of his authentic self to show in interviews and public appearances, dropping some of the theatrical armor he'd worn for years. This integration of his public and private selves reduced the psychological burden of maintaining two completely different identities. His relationship with music also evolved. While he still cared about creating quality work and connecting with audiences, he stopped defining his entire self-worth by commercial success or critical acclaim. Music became one part of his identity rather than the entirety of it, which paradoxically made him a better artist because he was creating from a place of genuine inspiration rather than desperate need for validation. The depression never completely disappeared. It would shadow him for the rest of his life, with periodic episodes that required careful management. But Freddie developed the tools and the support system to navigate these dark periods without being destroyed by them. And what he learned during this battle would prepare him for the even greater challenges ahead when his AIDS diagnosis would test everything he'd gained. The legacy of struggle. Today, understanding Freddie's battle with depression adds profound context to his artistic legacy. The man who appeared superhuman on stage was fighting very human battles with mental health, and his courage in confronting these challenges, even when he did so privately, deserves recognition alongside his musical achievements. His story also highlights the particular challenges faced by LGBTQ+ artists in the 1980s, who often suffered in silence because acknowledging mental health struggles could expose them to additional discrimination and prejudice. Freddie's depression wasn't just about chemical imbalances in his brain. It was also about the psychological toll of living in a society that rejected a fundamental part of his identity. The friends who supported Freddie through his darkest period demonstrated the life-saving power of genuine human connection. In an industry known for superficial relationships and fair-weather friendships, the loyalty and compassion shown by Mary Austin, Jim Hutton, and his Queen bandmates prove that authentic support can mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Perhaps most importantly, Freddie's journey from the edge of despair to renewed purpose shows that mental health struggles don't disqualify someone from greatness. Some of Queen's most enduring work was created after Freddie's depression diagnosis, proving that healing doesn't mean becoming someone different. It means becoming more fully yourself. The silence we must break. Freddie Mercury's secret battle with depression remained largely hidden during his lifetime, emerging only gradually through the memories shared by those who knew him best. That secrecy was protective but also tragic, preventing his story from helping others who might have found comfort in knowing that even legends struggle with darkness. Today, we understand mental health differently than we did in the 1980s. We know that depression is a medical condition, not a character weakness. We recognize the importance of professional treatment and peer support. We've learned that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's often the most courageous thing a person can display. If Freddie were alive today, perhaps he could speak openly about his battle with depression, using his platform to reduce stigma and encourage others to seek help. Instead, we're left with fragments of his story, pieced together from those who loved him and witnessed his struggle. But even these fragments carry power, reminding us that behind every confident performance might be someone fighting battles we can't see. That's the heartbreaking truth about Freddie Mercury's secret battle with depression and how he found the strength to keep performing even while fighting his darkest demons. If this story touched you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Mercury Moments family for more untold chapters from Queen's legendary frontman's life. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the importance of mental health awareness, and let us know in the comments if Freddie's struggle resonates with your own experiences. Until next time, remember, even legends need help sometimes, and asking for it is the bravest thing you can do.